Last time the Ming commander Li Rusong brought overwhelming force against Konishi Yukinaga at Pyongyang. But Konishi was still able to force enough of a standstill against Li Rusong that he was able to slip out undetected during the night. And this time the Ming are back on the move. I'm Stefan, and this is Japan at War. Even though Korean officials had begged Li Rusong immediately to pursue the Japanese, he hadn't. Instead, he held his army at Pyongyang for 5 days. Now, this was mostly due to his men being exhausted from battle, though I'm sure he was also being cautious and was probably concerned about Japanese counterattack. There was also a matter of food to deal with. The Ming army had already exhausted most of their supplies, and the 5-day rest would allow the Korean commissioner Yu Song-yong to race ahead and gather supplies for the Ming, just as he had done before. He did, and the Ming set out again, this time towards Seoul. As Li Rusong led his men south from Pyongyang, he was thrilled to find that the Japanese had retreated and left all the roads clear. And when he reached Kaesong, the strongest fortification in the area on the way to Seoul, he and his men found that it had also been abandoned. Now, this had to have made the commander incredibly happy. He thought that he would have had to fight all the way to Seoul, and now it seemed that the Japanese were actually on the run from him. They marched into Kaesong on February 19th with the commander's younger brother, Li Rusong, leading the way. The Ming decided to stay there and rest for a few days. Now, in a previous episode, I mentioned that a letter was on its way to Hamgyong to Kato Kiyomasa with the command to fall back to Seoul. Well, he'd finally gotten it, and he wasn't thrilled at the idea of retreating or helping out the other commanders that, in his opinion, were just failures. But as the Ming continued to advance south, it actually threatened to cut his forces off from the rest of the Japanese. And there had also been increasing Korean guerrilla attacks. These concerns were actually proven true when an envoy from Li Rusong arrived with a letter demanding his surrender. Now, if you've been following this series, you'll know that Kato isn't the kind of guy that surrenders. Kato, as a response, took a captive woman that was considered to be the most beautiful in all the province, tied her to a tree, and with the Chinese envoy watching, impaled her with his spear. The envoy turned and left to give Kato's response to his commander. Kato Kiyomasa and Nabeshima Naoshige pulled out from the area on the 22nd and made their way to Seoul, and they would arrive on the 1st of March. Now back at Kaesong, the Koreans were pressing the commander to attack, and Li was still being cautious though. When his forces had captured the city of Pyongyang, they had also captured some of the Japanese foot soldiers. They had told him that Seoul had 100,000 soldiers protecting it. And now, you and I both know that that's not true. But he didn't, so it gave him pause. Yu Song-yong decided that he actually needed to see it for himself, so he set off on horse to the Imjin River. His report read that at most, there was only 10,000. Now, with this information, Li decided that he would have to go personally to the river to verify this information. But before he left, he ordered Gao Se and Liang Jin to repair Pyongyang with 3,000 men. Commander Li crossed over the Imjin River and had some of his men set up camp at Paju, which was around 45 kilometers from Seoul, on the 26th of February. He then set out 3,000 men to scout out the terrain and defensive measures made by the Japanese. They then came across a sentry force that quickly retreated to warn their Japanese commanders. In the early morning of February 27th, the Ming scouting force crossed Halimmyeong Hill around 21 kilometers from Seoul and arrived at Byeokjegwan under the cover of fog. A small skirmish broke out at around 2 a.m., and both sides actually disengaged quite quickly as neither was quite confident that they would win. Now, after hearing about this skirmish, Tachibana Muneshige took his men and marched out of the west gate and arrived at Yeoseong-hyun at 6 a.m. Now, I'd like to pause here and mention that currently the Ming force is around 4,200 to 5,500. And these would be cavalry units due to the fact that his foot soldiers had been left behind. He felt that they would actually slow his forces down, and this current mission was actually just intended to be reconnaissance. Now, Ming commander Chada Xiao had around 600 cavalry troops, and Korean commander Go Yeonbyak, with a little over 100 cavalry troops, moved slightly ahead of the rest of the 2,500 plus scouting force. Tachibana Muneshige and his 2,000 men moved forward at a cautious pace. Commander Totoki Tsuruhisa rushed forward with his 500 light cavalrymen, followed closely by Ono Shigeyuki and his 700 cavalry. At 7 a.m., the Ming went forward to engage Tsuruhisa's force. As Tsuruhisa's men charged forward, the Ming turned their force around and actually withdrew. Tsuruhisa chased after them, but doing so actually exposed his flank to the Ming in waiting. The Ming attacked from both sides and pounded away at the Japanese with their hand cannons and arrows. And after taking unacceptable casualties, Tsuruhisa retreated towards his ally Ono Shigeyuki, and both then retreated towards Tachibana's army. Tachibana and his men then moved forward to engage with the Ming. Tachibana was at a severe disadvantage though, as his men only had short spears, swords, and only around 200 cavalrymen. And on top of that, the battle was done on flat terrain, which definitely favored the cavalry units. After a bit of fighting, Tachibana Muneshige withdrew back towards the hills of Sinwanjeom. By using the narrow passes to his advantage, Tachibana was able to bring up around 200 matchlocks to slow down the Ming. At 10 a.m., Kobayakawa, Takakage, and the rest of the 1st Division arrived and then rushed forward to relieve Tachibana's men, which were spread out on the Yeoseong-hyun hills. Kobayakawa's forces numbered around 12,000, and with them being so badly outnumbered, the Ming withdrew back. At the same time that this was happening, Li Rusong was en route, and on his way he met some of the bloody Korean officers retreating that told him about the Japanese reinforcements. Now after hearing this, he rushed forward towards Byeokjegwan with half of his men. The commander had a plan though. He wanted to take his forces around the hill along the western path towards a small plain of flat land. Now the idea was that this would essentially trap the Japanese on this hill, and the small narrow paths that lead in and out could actually then be used against them. When he did finally take his 1,000-man cavalry army around, he ran straight into Awaya Kagakatsu and his 3,000-man army. Li Rusong had his cavalrymen fire rockets known as Senji Jian, and prompted Awaya to have his matchlock men return fire from the front line. Now, Li Rusong surprised the Japanese by having his men charge right into the front lines as they started to reload. Not wanting to risk his own men, Awaya Kagakatsu had his men retreat back into the hill. And then Li did something very unexpected and very unfortunate for him. He pursued the Japanese, which exposed his flank. The commander, Inoue Kagesada, attacked Li Rusong's left flank, and Awaya Kagakatsu turned his forces around and attacked. They attempted to keep him busy long enough for the rest of the Japanese army to attempt to surround the Ming forces. Now Li knew that the battle was lost and ordered his men to retreat. He stayed behind to cover his men and then had all the supplies that his men had brought with them thrown onto the road to block the way. At the same time, Yang Yuan arrived with 1,000 more men to aid Li in his escape. What was left of Li's forces then withdrew back to Paju. And this is where I will leave you. The Ming, underestimating what strength the Japanese still had. But we also saw incredible bravery from Li Rusong. And I should also remind you that this battle wasn't actually supposed to happen. The purpose was supposed to be a reconnaissance, but things don't always go the way we plan it, does it? I'll see you next time.